Hello everyone and welcome to the lecture on AWS PrivateLink. So this lecture will contain all these topics. What is AWS PrivateLink? AWS PrivateLink concepts, AWS PrivateLink consumers and endpoints, then summary, get started with AWS PrivateLink, access through public service endpoints, connect through AWS PrivateLink, AWS services that integrate with AWS PrivateLink. So what is AWS PrivateLink? AWS PrivateLink is a highly available, scalable technology that enables you to privately connect your VPC to services, AWS services and resources as if they were in your own VPC, which is Virtual Private Cloud. You do not need to use an internet gateway, a NAT device, public IP address, AWS Direct Connect connection, or AWS site-to-site VPN connection to allow communication with the AWS services or resources from your private subnets. With AWS PrivateLink, you control the specific API endpoints, sites, services, and resources that are reachable from your virtual private cloud. AWS PrivateLink concepts. So first one is VPC. So a VPC is a logically isolated virtual private network that you can define within AWS. You can enable connections from your VPC to the outside world using methods like an internet gateway, a VPN connection, or use AWS PrivateLink. AWS PrivateLink allows clients within your VPC to connect to services, which is AWS services and AWS resources in other VPCs using private IP address as if those resources and services were hosted directly in your virtual private cloud. A service provider is the owner of a service. This can include AWS, AWS partners, and other AWS accounts. Service providers can host services using AWS resources or on-premises servers. Resource provider. The resource provider is the owner of a resource like a database or a cluster of nodes. This can include AWS services, AWS partners, and other AWS accounts. These resources can be in VPCs or on-premises. Endpoint services. A service provider creates an endpoint service to make their service available in a specific AWS region, using a load balancer to route incoming requests from service consumers. Service permissions. So by default, an endpoint service is not accessible to consumers. The service provider must set permissions which allows specific AWS principals to connect to their endpoint service. Service names. Each endpoint service has a unique service name. Service consumers must know and specify this name when creating a VPC endpoint. Service providers are responsible for sharing these service names. Service states. Endpoint services can be in the following states: pending, that is being created, or available, failed, deleting, or deleted. Resource configuration. A resource configuration is a logical representation of a single resource, like a database, for example, or a group of resources, like a cluster. It can be an IP address, a domain name target, or Amazon RDS database. Resource sharing. Resource providers share their resources using an AWS Resource Access Manager RAM resource share. This permits specific AWS principals to connect to their resource via a resource VPC endpoint. Resource gateway. A resource gateway is the entry point into a VPC for shared resources. It is created by the resource provider to facilitate the sharing of resources from their VPC. AWS PrivateLink consumers and endpoints. Consumers. A consumer is a user of a service or a resource. Consumers can access endpoint services and resources from their VPCs or from their on-premises environments. VPC endpoints. A consumer creates a VPC endpoint to connect their VPC to an endpoint service or a resource. There are multiple types of VPC endpoints, and you must create the type that meets your specific needs. Interface endpoint. An interface endpoint is used to send TCP or UDP traffic to an endpoint service. Traffic is resolved using DNS. Gateway Load Balancer Endpoint. A gateway load balancer endpoint is used to send traffic to a fleet of virtual appliances using private IP addresses. Traffic is routed through route tables, and the load balancer distributes traffic and scales with demand. Resource Endpoint. A resource endpoint allows access to a resource that was shared from another VPC. It provides private and secure access to resources like databases, clusters, and instances without needing a load balancer. Service Network Endpoint. A service network endpoint is used to access a service network that you created or was shared with you. A single endpoint allows access to multiple associated resources and services. Gateway Endpoint. A gateway endpoint is a different type that sends traffic to Amazon S3 or DynamoDB. It does not use AWS PrivateLink. Endpoint Network Interfaces. An endpoint network interface serves as an entry point for traffic to an endpoint service, resource, or service network. Each subnet in a VPC endpoint gets an endpoint network interface with an IPv4 and IPv6 addresses. Endpoint Policies. A VPC endpoint policy is an IAM resource policy attached to the endpoint. It determines which principals can use the endpoint to access the service. The default policy allows all actions by all principals on all resources. Endpoint States. VPC endpoints can be in various states including pending acceptance, which are manual requests, pending, which are automatic requests, available, which is ready for use, rejected, expired, failed, deleting, and deleted. So, in summary, you can create VPC endpoints to connect clients in your VPC to services and resources that integrate with AWS PrivateLink. You can create your own VPC endpoint service and make it available to other AWS consumers. So in this diagram, the VPC on the top has several Amazon EC2 instances in a private subnet and 5 VPC endpoints, 3 interface VPC endpoints, a resource VPC endpoint, and a service network VPC endpoint. The first interface VPC endpoint connects to an AWS service. The second interface VPC endpoint connects to a service hosted by another AWS account, a VPC endpoint service. The third interface VPC endpoint connects to an AWS Marketplace partner service. The resource VPC endpoint connects to a database. The net service network VPC endpoints connect to a service network. So how to get started with AWS PrivateLink? So this diagram demonstrates how to send a request from an EC2 instance in a private subnet to Amazon CloudWatch using PrivateLink. So CloudWatch is a global service, the endpoint. So in this particular scenario, we are trying to access through the private network. So it will not go to the global public IP address space. It will go directly via the private subnet through VPC. So this is how we bypass the public route. Second, to connect from your computer to the instance in the private subnet, you will first connect to a Bastion host in a public subnet. So from here, we are connecting to a Bastion host which is in a public subnet. So basically, Bastion host is like a jump host to first get into a network, then you go into the private subnet. Then both the Bastion host and the instance must use the same key pair. So here and here we are using same public-private key pair to log into SSH. Because the .pem file for the private key is on your computer, not the Bastion host, you will use SSH key forwarding. So here you will use SSH key forwarding to go into this particular machine from here to here. Then you can connect to the instance from the Bastion host without specifying the .pem file in the SSH command. And after you have set up a VPC endpoint for CloudWatch, so you have to set up a VPC endpoint here for this particular CloudWatch service because it's a global public service, but you will set it a virtual private cloud endpoint, private endpoint. So traffic from the instance that is destined for CloudWatch is resolved to the network interface, elastic network interface, and then sent to the CloudWatch using VPC endpoint. So this will be introduced, and through this it will go here. Now access through public service endpoints. For instances in public subnets, traffic to AWS services is routed through the internet gateway and directly to the service while remaining within AWS network infrastructure. So this is for this case, it will go via internet gateway. So public subnet, it will come here and then it will go to here. For instances in private subnets, traffic follows a path through NAT gateway first, then the internet gateway before reaching the AWS services, maintaining secure connectivity. So traffic which are in private subnet, it will come to a NAT gateway first, which will be in a public subnet, and then it goes to internet gateway, and then finally it will reach all the AWS global services. Network security is maintained throughout as all traffic stays within the AWS infrastructure using internal routing mechanism even when passing through internet gateways. So now if you want to connect through AWS PrivateLink, you have internet interface VPC endpoint creation involves establishing connections between your VPC subnets and AWS services through dedicated network interfaces enabling private service access. So by creating this VPC endpoint, you enable communication from the private subnet through elastic network interface to all these services. Traffic flow is managed through DNS resolution, where service requests are resolved to private IP addresses of endpoint network interfaces before being routed to the AWS services. So you will get a DNS private endpoint, which will be like a DNS name, and through that it will know how to route the traffic without going to the public internet. Secure service access is achieved through private connectivity, ensuring protected communication between your VPC and AWS services through direct, secure endpoint connections. So AWS services that integrate with PrivateLink, actually the list is very huge, but I have just put 20 most popular services, starting from the most used and which are most important ones. So these are the one: EC2, Amazon S3, RDS, AWS Lambda, DynamoDB, AWS Identity and Access Management, IAM, Amazon VPC, Amazon CloudWatch, Amazon SNS, AWS CloudFormation, Amazon SQS, AWS ECS, Elastic Container Service, EKS, Elastic Kubernetes Service, AWS CloudTrail, Amazon API Gateway, AWS Secrets Manager, AWS Systems Manager, Elastic Load Balancing, Amazon Event Bridge, AWS Core Pipeline, and Amazon Elastic Cache. So just to summarize, basically PrivateLink before, this is a kind of not very new technology, but earlier if you want to access all these services from, let's say, EC2, automatically your traffic will route. For example, if you are going to CloudWatch, it will automatically, or S3, the traffic will automatically get routed to public internet. But through this technology, they have made sure that almost all AWS services can directly communicate privately. So you don't have to enable. So basically, it's a very secure service that saves you money because you don't have to go to public route, and your traffic is secure because it stays entirely within the AWS backbone network and it never goes out, and it improves the performance as well. So this is the main purpose of this particular service. And that's all. Thanks for watching.